tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.
One issue that we have been covering all week has been the United Nations' ongoing efforts to push a plastics treaty. We have the big confab in Ottawa this week, thousands of delegates from around the world. We had the federal government on Monday announce the formation of a plastics registry, which will be coming around 2025, I believe. And we've talked about some of the details on that. But I think at its core, we have to really go back to first principles here, because what the federal government has done is really designated plastic as a toxin. And once you've done that, once you say plastic is toxic, you're actually able to justify a lot, which was why the federal government was slapped down in the way that it was when it had that single-use plastics ban. The Conservative Party of Canada now has decided to launch a campaign to bring back the plastic straws, which, isn't, we don't have the photo handy, but that's an issue near and dear to my heart, the plastic straw crusade by the government. But let's actually talk about the science here. We have always been told we have to follow the science. What does the science say on plastics? I wanted to bring into the show Dr. Chris DeArmitt. He's the president of Phantom Plastics. Now, he actually is an expert on this. He's not just a guy who is in the industry and represents a commercial interest. He actually knows the science in and out on this and has spoken about it around the world. Chris, it's good to talk to you. Thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Yeah, thank you for having me on the show. I appreciate it.
So let's talk first and foremost about that idea of plastic being a toxin. What's the argument that they advance to justify this? And why would you say they're getting it wrong, or what are they missing?
Yeah, that's a great point. So you can't just make up things and say this is that or that's the other. I mean, there are scientific ways of telling what's toxic and what isn't toxic. So when that accusation was made, I went and looked up the science. And that's the problem in general. People say, this person's for plastic, against plastic. We shouldn't be for or against anything. We should be for finding what's true, right? And then once we found the evidence, once we found what's true, then we move on from there and make sensible choices. And people have forgotten that. They're so busy taking sides, no one's checking the facts. So I'm looking at a table right here, which I've posted online, which is, the EPA's definition of what's toxic and what's less toxic. And if we look at plastics, we like polyethylene, polypropylene, PET, and so forth, we find that they're the safest things. So there are 4 categories of toxicity. They're in the safest category that there is. So they're as safe as things we have on our table. They're safer than table salt, for example. And I'm looking at a list of, they're as safe as alcohol, which we drink every day. That's the category that these plastics are in. They're literally so safe you could eat them every day and nothing would happen to you. So it's, whereas if you look at things like copper metal, which drinking water pipes are made of, they're in the most toxic category. So there are ways of telling what's toxic, what isn't toxic. There are literally numbers that define how much of this you can ingest and have a problem or not have a problem. And plastics are simply non-toxic. So for somebody to just make up in his bathtub one day, this is toxic and I decree it so. He's not Julius Caesar, right? I mean, there are actual ways, and scientists have been studying this for 50 years, right? It's all documented and available to the public. So it's beyond absurd that somebody should make such a proclamation.
Well, and I find that in this argument, and certainly when you look at the policy response to it, they conflate 2 issues, because you could say plastic is non-toxic, but there is a pollution issue. And you could say we don't like plastic that's being dumped in the oceans in parts of the world. But you're right that when they use the toxic label to justify policy, which is what the federal government in Canada did, it just doesn't have a basis at all. So how do they argue that it is when the evidence is so clear on this that it isn't?
That's strange. I haven't looked into their argument, actually. I haven't. So I'm a scientist. I
don't think there's much there.
They just made it up. I do know that I looked at the same guy, and it's so funny that they call him Right Honorable, because it appears to be anything but honorable as far as I can tell, because whenever I compare what he says to what science says, they're the exact opposite. He tried to ban a flame retardant called DBDPE, and I wrote a report. I was so outraged that I wrote a report and read all the science on that. He proposed banning one of the safest flame retardants that prevents Canadians from dying in their bed in flames, based on 0 evidence. He had not one piece of experimental evidence upon which to declare this stuff is dangerous. And there is science on that substance. It's been thoroughly tested for years and years and years and found to be completely safe. It's so safe that if you eat it, like not a molecule of it dissolves because it's completely insoluble. So they say that they're banning this flame retardant on the precautionary principle, which means better safe than sorry. Whereas what they're actually doing is the opposite. It's better sorry than safe. You're saying, okay, I'd rather that hundreds of Canadians potentially die in flames on the one hand versus zero evidence of toxicity on the other. And that's what happens when you let ideology get it out of control and forget to check the data.
Just as a complete non-scientist here, I'll ask you, are all plastics, when it comes to the toxicity question, are all plastics created equally? Or is there a distinction between, the plastic that's in a plastic straw and the plastic that's in an industrial PVC pipe?
Yeah, well, in general, plastics are made of really big molecules. And so the FDA has declared them basically safe. So plastics are assumed to be safe because they don't migrate around. The molecules can't move. They can't go through your skin, for example. The molecules can't go through your skin. They're so large. So they're considered, due to their very nature, safer than almost all chemicals. Is there a plastic that's toxic? I don't know of one. I've looked at all the major thermoplastics, and I don't think I can think of a plastic right now that's toxic. And if another question that people ask is, okay, well, maybe the plastic's not toxic, but what about the additives in them? And that table I just mentioned, I looked up the toxicity of the standard additives in these plastics like polyethylene, polypropylene. And don't forget, these are things FDA approved that you can put them in your mouth and store food in them. So they've already been tested and found to be safe. We know what migrates out of them, the additives, if they come out and how much. But even the additives themselves, when you check their toxicity, they're the same as plastics. They're so safe you can eat teaspoons of them and nothing happens to you.
Might not be delicious though. But flavor is not the metric here. So let's take a look at what's happening in Ottawa this week. We have the world leaders on this trying to convene to create a plastic treaty. And you have the federal government in Canada saying we need a plastic registry. Companies need to account for all that they're doing and creating. I know you've actually consulted with a lot of these companies in the past. And as I've understood it, a lot of them are well aware of what they're producing and where it's going. I mean, this is just a basic part of what they're doing from an industrial perspective. And I don't see why the hand of government is what's needed here.
Yeah. So let me give some perspective on that. My job is to be a plastic scientist, and I've done it for decades, right? The thing that I'm discussing with you today is not what I get paid to do. I'm not paid to be a plastic environmentalist. The reason I got into this is that my own daughters were taught lies at school, and that made me angry. So as a hobby, I read 4,000 scientific studies, and I found that nobody's checking the facts. The media aren't checking the facts, apart from people like you who crusade for truth like I do. And the green groups are making hundreds of millions of dollars from telling lies, because every time you compare what they say to the facts, you find that they're the exact opposite, as I mentioned. So have you ever heard that we eat a credit card of plastics a week, for example? The latest scientific peer-reviewed study said it would take 20,000 years to eat a credit card of plastic. But guess what? These green groups have got that up on their websites right next to a big, juicy donate now button, right? And if you want to understand something, follow the money. So I'm not here to defend plastics. I'm not here to do anything other than take the evidence, which was really tedious. I didn't have these reading glasses before I started reading these thousands of studies. So I take the evidence and present it fairly. So if you look on my website or in my free book, you'll see that everything that I quote is cited verbatim, where I literally copy and paste from the study with zero spin and cite the study so you can click a link and go and check it yourself. And that's where we should start. Let's not start with pro-plastic or against plastic. Let's start with what's true and what isn't true. And to your point, probably the single most disappointing thing for me is that this thing with plastics is a big distraction. If you look at what's actually harming the environment, plastic is 0.5% of the materials we use. So in our obsession to talk about plastic all day and all night, which is 0.5% of the materials we use, it's the greenest option in 90% of cases, according to life cycle studies. So we're obsessing over 0.5% of all of our materials. That's almost always the least harmful option, and completely ignoring the 99% of material, which is almost always the most harmful option. So the issue isn't that plastics have an impact. They certainly do. And there is litter, but it's not just plastic that's litter, and litter isn't caused by materials either. It's caused by people. So pretty much everything is off track here. We're not making any impact, and we're in fact doomed to failure if we keep obsessing over plastic and not talking about the 99% of problematic materials.
Well, and also a lot of these objectives from the green industry tend to butt up against each other. I was skimming through your book, The Plastics Paradox, and one of the headlines you cite is about Coca-Cola, in that Coca-Cola was so committed to reducing its carbon footprint, they got rid of aluminum and switched to plastic bottle collection. So here you have, again, a company saying, oh, wow, we have to do the right thing for the environment. Plastic is the environmentally superior alternative.
Yes, the only way to know what's more harmful and less harmful is something called a life cycle analysis. And that's accepted by governments and NGOs and companies all around the world. And it's scientifically proven for 50 years and honed to become better and better. And it's peer reviewed, so it's hard to cheat, right? And there are 5 such studies on drink containers that you just mentioned. And they all say that the plastic bottle causes least harm. So why would you ever go to metal or glass, which is scientifically proven to cause vastly more harm? And I'm not just talking about CO2, vastly more fossil fuel burned, because you need a lot of energy to make to melt glass and metal, and more of the other things as well, like eutrophication and acid rain and so forth. It's when you switch to an alternative, you end up with more waste, more harm in almost every parameter you can measure.
Yeah, and the thing is that we have to look at what we are creating plastic to replace and what those alternatives are. I mean, people would love to say, all right, let's take the plastic bottle away. And sure, maybe we could all use a reusable water bottle that somehow is better than a plastic water bottle. But for the most part, I don't think it works out. And anyone who's ever had reusable grocery bags knows you basically buy as many of them as you would use plastic bags because you forget them at home. And I feel that it's more intensive here. But plastic is replacing something. And, I'll read the list that you have here: paper, cotton, glass, and metal. You have to pick one material of those, and plastic is generally the best of them.
If you look at 100 life cycle studies, plastic beats those materials in every study I've seen. The only things that are consistently greener than plastic are wood and wool. And unfortunately, we can't run the internet based on a knitted computer and a wooden wires coming to our house.
And
right?
my wool straw hasn't taken off yet. I need to go back and rework the prototype.
So yeah, there are things that are greener than plastic in certain applications, and I say that in my book because I am genuinely just trying to be honest here and show people the facts so they can make smart choices. So what we have is a bunch of green groups who, as Dr. Patrick Moore said, and I have his book in front of me. Here's 2 of his books. This is a guy who was the president of Greenpeace. And he left in disgust and said they just make up lies for donations. They abandoned the environment decades ago, according to him. And the other big green groups did the same thing. They're making hundreds of millions from just saying things that aren't true when you check the science. And that's the problem, because government's listening to these people. I was just in Ottawa with a bunch of these people all around telling whoppers all day long. Whereas the plastics people are in there spending hundreds of millions of their own money, losing money sometimes, doing things which are the right thing to do, even though they might not be profitable. It's exactly the wrong way around. When we're kids, we're taught that it's the big bad industry, and then there are these crusaders for truth. But this has been distorted and turned the other way around, where the people that we think crusade for truth are just telling us lies all the time.
So let me ask you, and I fear I know the answer to this, but perhaps you can set me at ease. Do governments call you up? Do politicians call you up when they're putting these policies in place? Or is it done completely in the absence of all this evidence you've collected over the years?
Yeah, so as I said, this is a hobby. And for the first 3 years, so I've done it all unpaid, not a single penny, right? And in the beginning, people were really shocked at the message because they'd never seen the truth before. So they were rightfully amazed. And I said, well, please look, because there are 2 sides and one side has the evidence on it. So now we're a few years later and I'm being asked to give speeches, and governments are asking me. So the Canadian shadow government has asked me to testify and show the facts. And the United Arab Emirates said, hey, we don't want to make the same mistakes that they made in Europe and in America and Canada. We want to start afresh, look at the evidence, and then make policies. Because you mentioned bags a second ago. There was a bag ban in New Jersey, and they looked afterwards to see what happened. And what happened after the ban was just what you said would happen. They had vastly higher sales of plastic because these very thin plastic bags had to be replaced with much thicker bags. So you go and buy an actual garbage can liner, which is 5 times thicker than a transparent polyethylene grocery bag. And they had what they said was exponentially more greenhouse gas. And that's exactly what we would have predicted by the 30 studies which are published that said that would happen. And instead, they just implement these policies. And it literally takes you 10 seconds to do a Google search. You can go into Google now and type in LCA BAG, and you will find peer-reviewed life cycle studies. Why has no politician ever done that? Why hasn't Greenpeace or the World Wildlife Fund or Ellen MacArthur Foundation in the last years and years and years ever occurred to them to do a Google search on the very topic that they claim to care about? That is shocking, and that really shows what their true motives are.
Well, I'm glad you've made your book available for free. They have no excuse to not read it. The Plastics Paradox. I dug into it this week, and I hope to finish it on the weekend. But Dr. Chris DeArmitt, thank you so much, sir. Really great to talk to you.
Thanks for caring about evidence. I really respect that. Cheers. Thanks.
All right. I appreciate your appreciation of it. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.